The US throws its weight around by using sanctions as a diplomatic tool to force countries to comply with international law and achieve specific foreign policy goals. These measures aren't just about flexing muscle. They're like saying, play by the rules or prepare yourself for the consequences. What exactly do these sanctions entail? Well, they include seizing property, trade restrictions, visa restrictions, arms embargoes, travel bans, etc. The US using sanction as a weapon for some time now. In 1917, during the World War I, the US imposed an embargo on exports of certain goods to Japan, including war materials such as steel and iron. This move was aimed at conserving resources for the war effort and maintaining strict neutrality. While the impact of these sanctions on Japan was limited, but they contributed to growing tensions between the two countries. However, the sanctions imposed on Japan in 1940-41 were far more consequential. These included freezing Japanese assets in the United States, slapping restrictions on exports of oil and scrap metal to Japan, and putting embargoes on strategic goods. While the US did not anticipate or desire war with Japan, the sanctions were part of a broader strategy to contain Japanese aggression and protect US interests in the Pacific. But this led to the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, which was a direct response to the oil sanctions on Japan. Ultimately, these sanctions played a significant role in precipitating the US entry into World War II. So how does the US use sanctions to control smaller countries in present days? Nowadays, the US utilizes sanctions, or the threat of sanctions, to exert control over other countries. Since the US dollar serves as the primary currency for global trade, many countries use it for international transactions and as a reserve currency. Smaller countries, which have limited financial resources and rely heavily on international trade and finance, can suffer greatly from sanctions. As a result, they have to comply with US demands to avoid facing repercussions. And sometimes, the mere threat of imposing sanctions is enough for the US to influence the behavior of other countries and advance its interests. This tactic has proven effective in various situations. For example, the US and other world powers leveraged sanctions to push Iran into negotiating the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, aiming to curb Iran's nuclear program in exchange for lifting sanctions. Iran came to the table primarily due to concerns about the economic impacts of ongoing sanctions pressure. Another example is the US sanctions on North Korea, which aim to halt its nuclear weapons program. The fear of increased economic isolation and the desire to avoid harsher sanctions have motivated North Korea to engage in diplomatic talks. Although significant progress has been limited, in Venezuela, US sanctions target human rights abuses, corruption, and anti-democratic actions. The fear of further economic hardship and international isolation has influenced the Venezuelan government's behavior and its stance in negotiations with opposition groups. The US has also employed its sanctions tactics with India several times in the past. Despite this, US-India relations are currently stronger than ever. However, the US occasionally uses the threat of sanctions as a strategic tool. Despite these efforts, the US has never succeeded in pressuring India to fully conform to its will. Let me give you some examples. The United States has historically been opposed and never wanted India to have nuclear weapons. India wanted nuclear weapons not to threaten any country, but rather as a means of asserting its sovereignty on the global stage. In 1974, India conducted its first nuclear weapons test under the codename Smiling Buddha. Despite this milestone, India still found itself not quite on par with established nuclear states. Over the next 2 decades, successive Indian prime ministers attempted to advance nuclear research efforts. However, the specter of American surveillance satellites and the looming threat of sanctions proved to be significant obstacles. Despite these challenges, the fear of sanctions did not deter India from pursuing its nuclear ambitions. In 1998, India made a bold move by conducting a series of nuclear tests declaring itself a full-fledged nuclear state. And as expected, the US responded by slapping economic sanctions on India. This reaction was hardly surprising, given the US's track record. What some Europeans and the Japanese did is irrelevant, as they typically follow the US's lead, and would likely lift their sanctions as soon as Washington does. The US placed a ban on 208 Indian entities, including both private and public sectors, particularly those contributing to India's nuclear missile and weapons programs. However, these sanctions didn't significantly halt or slow down India's nuclear advancements. Today, India has over 160 nuclear weapons, and enough weapons-grade plutonium, approximately 700 kilograms, for up to 213 warheads. Its missiles are capable of carrying multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles with intercontinental ranges. Additionally, Indian engineers are building 6 fast breeder reactors by 2033 to produce both electric power and fissile material. Before that, the US opposed India's acquisition of cryogenic engine technology for its space launch vehicles, fearing its potential for longer-range ballistic missiles. This led to pressure on Russia to halt the transfer, though the threat of sanctions temporarily slowed down India's aspirations for a more powerful launch vehicle, but it did not deter India entirely. In fact, India has since developed and successfully launched moon missions using its indigenous cryogenic launch vehicles. In 2019, the US imposed sanctions on countries importing oil from Iran, aiming to pressure Iran over its nuclear program. India, which relied on Iranian oil imports, initially complied with the sanctions, but later resumed limited imports from Iran. Despite US pressure, India sought waivers and alternative arrangements to maintain its energy security, highlighting its willingness to prioritize its national interests over US sanctions. In 2018, India signed a deal with Russia to purchase the S-400 missile defense system, despite the threat of US sanctions, under the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. While the US expressed concerns about the deal and the potential for sanctions, India proceeded with the purchase, citing its national security interests and long-standing defense ties with Russia. And the funny thing is, US sanctions Turkey over purchase of Russian S-400 missile system. The Chabahar port project in Iran is indeed another significant example where US sanctions have not deterred India from pursuing its strategic interests. And recently, the United States issued a warning to anyone considering business deals with Iran without specifically mentioning India. This warning came just hours after India and Iran signed the Chabahar port agreement. India's participation in the development of the Chabahar port serves its strategic goals of improving connectivity and trade with Afghanistan and Central Asia, bypassing Pakistan. Despite US sanctions on Iran, India has persisted in its involvement with the Chabahar project, seeing it as vital for regional stability and its own economic interests. In short, the US pressure has had limited effect on India. But what is the reason behind it? The thing is, it's not because the US has any particular affection towards India. It rarely does with any country. And the closest relationship it comes to is with Israel, often considered the most special bilateral relationship. However, back in March, the United Nations Security Council finally passed a resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The United States, which had been the only remaining hurdle to such a call, decided not to strike down the resolution. The vote came as a shock to Israel, which saw its decades-old ally US abstain rather than veto the move, as it has consistently done over the years in its diplomatic backing of Israel. Biden even said, while the US would continue to provide defensive weapons to Israel, specifically mentioning the Iron Dome air defense system. However, he also warned that, if Israel were to start a major ground invasion of Rafah, the US would stop other shipments of weapons to Israel. And France is another country, which is considered as a close ally of the US, that goes back 250 years. But what AUKUS did to France was brutal. France even said it had been betrayed by the US, after being pushed out of a multi-billion-dollar deal to supply submarines to Australia. and France even wants closer relations with China, as it was evident during the recent visit of Xi Jinping in France. The thing is, what India already knew for decades. The US allies are slowly realizing it. European leaders are becoming more inclined to increase military spending and create alliances without the US. In campaign speeches, Trump remained skeptical of organizations, such as NATO, suggesting that the US would not protect NATO allies if they don't spend enough on their own defense.
Well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want.
This worried NATO officials and European allies. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg warned that Trump risked endangering US troops and their allies. He said, any suggestion that allies will not defend each other undermines all of our security, including that of the US, and puts American and European soldiers at increased risk. But many of America's European NATO allies are worried that, with or without Trump, the US is becoming less reliable. Some have started to talk openly about the need for members to ramp up military spending and to plan for an alliance without the United States. With India, the US has enormous interest for countering China, and US cannot counter China in Asia without India's support. India cannot be controlled by any other power, certainly not by the US, by instilling fear of sanctions. It is too large, too powerful, and too populated to be yanked around as the pawn of some other nation. India is also well aware of its own interests and has a policy of conducting its foreign affairs as autonomously as possible. This policy is called strategic autonomy, where it can be friends with anyone it desired, like for example, America's enemies such as Iran, Russia, etc. Similarly, India is not opposed to working with other nations on interests of mutual concern. These nations include the US, UK, France, China, Japan, and Israel, as well as many other states. India's military is getting stronger day by day, and with India's economy is constantly growing, its military power is expected to grow significantly. But that is not the only reason why US wants India's help. COVID-19 has made America all too aware of its dependence on China for many essential manufactured goods. Only India can match China's vast population, low-cost labor availability, and deep base of world-class technical talent. The United States and India have strong political, cultural, and linguistic affinities, and both nations see China as a military and geopolitical rival. While American and Indian interests are not always aligned, the potential synergies, including moving manufacturing from China to India, are real. India-US ties also represent a big Indian market that America would love to have a piece of. They are even selling their advanced fighter jet engines to India, with 80% transfer of technology, which is actually impressive. And it's not that India is just now starting to counter China. Even when the West was busy cozying up to Beijing, New Delhi was challenging China on multiple fronts. For example, India was the first major nation to openly criticize Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative as a predatory infrastructure project. This critique has become part of the global consensus on BRI. India is now arming China's neighbors with state-of-the-art weapons, which not only enhances the buyer's military capabilities, allowing them to better defend themselves or potentially engage in offensive operations, but also signifies a certain level of political cooperation or alignment between the countries. It indicates trust and collaboration in military and strategic matters. Many countries in Southeast Asia are now potential buyers of Indian weapons, potentially altering the balance of power in the region. Just like the US did with Pakistan to counter India, and is still doing. Can India counter China alone? India cannot do it alone, it needs the help of the US and India's Western partners. The only way to counter China is by growing economically, and to do that, India needs a robust manufacturing infrastructure. This was ignored by previous governments in India, but thankfully, this is not the case now. As Jay Shankar said, India's rise in the future will be through technology. You cannot build strong technology on weak manufacturing. So with all this in line, sanctioning India and pushing it away again will be another detrimental move by the US, harming its dreams in the Indo-Pacific, and its broader geopolitical and economic objectives in the area.